I'd always heard about the dangers of Craigslist, but I never thought anything would happen to me. After all, I had been using the site for years, buying and selling things without any issues. But then, one day, I saw an ad that caught my eye. It was for a job as a caretaker for an old mansion on the outskirts of town. The pay was great, and the ad mentioned free room and board. I should have known it was too good to be true. When I arrived at the mansion, I was struck by how eerie it looked. The windows were boarded up, and the garden was overgrown and full of weeds. But I brushed off my unease and knocked on the door. A man answered, introducing himself as John. He was tall and lean, with piercing blue eyes and a wide, unnerving grin. Despite my misgivings, I followed him inside. As he showed me around the mansion, I couldn't help but feel like something was off. The walls were covered in strange symbols and sigils, and the air seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. But John was so friendly and charming that I pushed my doubts aside. Over the next few days, I settled into my new routine. I cleaned and maintained the mansion, and John provided me with meals and a room to sleep in. But as time went on, I began to notice strange things happening around the house. Objects would move on their own, and I would hear whispering voices in the middle of the night. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One day, while cleaning out the attic, I found a strange book. It was bound in black leather and had strange runes etched into the cover. As I flipped through the pages, I felt a sense of dread wash over me. The book was filled with spells and incantations, and I realized with horror that John was a practitioner of dark magic. I tried to confront him, but he just laughed it off, telling me I had nothing to worry about. But I knew better. I began to make plans to leave the mansion, but it was too late. One night, as I was sleeping, I felt something brush against my leg. I woke up to find a creature standing at the foot of my bed. It was small and grotesque, with sharp teeth and glowing red eyes. I screamed and tried to run, to no avail. The creature sank its teeth into my leg, and I felt a searing pain shoot through my body. I managed to break free and ran down the stairs, but John was waiting for me at the bottom. He had changed. His eyes were now a glowing, unnatural red, and his face was twisted into a sinister grin. I tried to run past him, but he caught me by the arm, pulling me back. "You have accomplished what I couldn't," he growled. "But I always knew it. I knew you were the one," he said. "The one who would open the portal and bring forth the creatures of the underworld. And now you're going to pay for taking what's rightfully mine." I figured that while reading the incantations and spells of the book in the attic, I had opened a doorway that was meant to be shut. Suddenly, one of the walls started to transform, and a dark pathway started to materialize before our eyes, growing in size by the second. As the portal opened wider, I felt the ground beneath me shake violently. The air was filled with a putrid stench, and I could hear the anguished cries of the damned emanating from the depths of the abyss. I tried to run, but my legs felt like lead. It was as if something was holding me in place, preventing me from escaping the mansion. I turned to face John, but he was no longer there. He had disappeared into the portal, leaving me to face the horrors alone. The creatures from the underworld began to emerge from the portal, and I watched in horror as they made their way towards me. Their eyes were black and soulless, and their skin was slick with blood and gore. I tried to scream, but my voice was silenced by the sheer terror of the moment. The creatures surrounded me, their tentacles reaching out to grab me. I felt their slimy grip tightening around my body, pulling me closer to the portal. I knew that if I was sucked into the abyss, I would never return. As I struggled against the creatures, I saw John emerge from the portal. He was different now, transformed by the dark magic he had summoned. His eyes were filled with a cold, calculating hatred, and he seemed to relish in my suffering. "You should have known better," he sneered. "You should have known that there is a price to pay for everything." With that, he began to chant in a language I did not understand. The creatures tightened their grip around me, and I felt myself slipping towards the portal. I closed my eyes, resigned to my fate. But just as I was about to be dragged into the abyss, I felt a sudden surge of energy coursing through my body. It was as if a switch had been flipped, and I was filled with an unnatural power. And then everything froze around me. I saw a bright light walking towards me. It was the spirit of my late grandmother. "Grandson," she said, "you have my gift, and with it, the power to defeat the malevolent energies trying to conquer you. Fight with your heart and soul, and you'll find your way." And as soon as she came, she dissipated in front of my eyes. But the unnatural power building inside of me continued to grow with vibrant energy. I fought against the creatures with renewed strength, their slimy tentacles slipping off my body. I pushed myself away from the portal, towards the safety of the mansion. The creatures hissed and spat, furious that their prey had escaped. I stumbled into the mansion, gasping for breath. The air was thick with the stench of sulfur, and I knew that the creatures were not far behind. I had to find a way to stop them, to prevent them from destroying everything in their path. I made my way to the basement, where I found the source of John's power. But next to his altar was the same small, ancient book, bound in black leather and adorned with strange symbols that I had discovered in the attic. By instinct, I opened the book, and towards the end of it, found a different set of incantations, its letters glowing in bright lights. I began to read, my voice shaky but determined. As I spoke the words, I felt the creatures outside begin to weaken. Their tentacles grew limp, and their eyes began to dim. But just as I was about to complete the ritual, John appeared behind me. He had followed me to the basement, and he was enraged. "You think you can stop me?" he sneered. "I have powers beyond your wildest dreams. You are nothing to me." With a flick of his wrist, John sent me flying across the room. I felt the wind knocked out of me as I hit the wall, my head slamming against the concrete. As I lay there dazed and confused, I saw John approach the book. He raised his hand, preparing to reverse my spells and fortify the creatures once again. But then something strange happened. The book began to glow, a brilliant light emanating from its pages. John recoiled, shielding his eyes from the brightness. In that moment, I knew what I had to do. I stumbled to my feet, my head pounding. I lunged towards John, tackling him and knocking him away from the book. He hit the ground hard, and the book fell open in front of him. As he scrambled to his feet, I saw the creatures begin to retreat back into the portal. The light from the book was too much for them to handle, and they slithered back into the abyss. John looked at me, hatred and fear etched on his face. "What have you done?" he spat. "You've ruined everything." But I knew that I had done the right thing. I had saved myself, and possibly even the world, from the horrors that lay beyond the portal. As I made my way back to the surface, book in hand, I knew that John would never give up. He would continue to search for ways to summon the creatures and unleash them upon the world. But I also knew that I would be ready for him. I left the mansion, my heart heavy with the knowledge of what I had seen and experienced. I knew that I would never forget the horrors that lay beyond the portal and the price that had been paid to keep them at bay. As I walked away, I heard a faint whisper in my ear. It was a voice I did not recognize, a voice that spoke of dark secrets and unspeakable evil. "You may have won this battle," the voice hissed, "but the war is far from over." Story 2. The Legend of the Black Robes. It was a slow day at work, and I found myself scrolling through Craigslist in search of some odd jobs to do for some extra cash. That's when I came across an unusual post. It read, "Looking for a caretaker for a private island. Generous compensation offered. Must be willing to stay on the island for 3 months. Serious inquiries only." The post intrigued me, and I decided to reach out to the poster. Within minutes, I received a response from someone named Mr. Johnson. He explained that the island was located off the coast of Maine, and that he was looking for someone to take care of his estate. The pay was too good to pass up, and following my spirit of adventure, I jumped at the opportunity. The next day, I boarded a small boat and headed out to the island. As I approached, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The island was completely isolated, and there was no sign of any other human life. When I arrived at the estate, I was greeted by Mr. Johnson himself. He was a tall, imposing figure with piercing eyes and a stern demeanor. He gave me a quick tour of the grounds and explained my duties, which included maintaining the property, taking care of his pets, and preparing meals. As the days went by, I settled into a routine. I spent most of my time taking care of the property, which was massive and required constant upkeep. But as the weeks passed, strange things began to happen. I started to hear noises coming from the forest at night. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the noises were too distinct to be natural. I would hear footsteps, whispers, and even the occasional scream. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the island. One day, while exploring the forest, I stumbled upon an old graveyard. The graves were old and weathered, and most of the names were impossible to read. As I stood there, I heard a voice behind me. It was Mr. Johnson, and he looked angry. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "I was just exploring," I replied nervously. "This part of the island is off limits," he said. "You should have known better." I apologized and quickly made my way back to the estate. But from that day on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong on the island. One night, I woke up to find Mr. Johnson standing over my bed. His eyes were glowing in the dark, and his expression was twisted into a sinister grin. He looked possessed. Before I could react, he lunged at me, pinning me down with his massive hands. I struggled to break free, but he was too strong. He whispered something in my ear, something that chilled me to the bone. "You should have never come here," he hissed. "You're mine now." He dragged me out of bed and took me to the basement of the estate. It was a dark, damp place with no windows or doors. He threw me into a small cell, locking the door behind him. For days, I was trapped in that cell with no food or water. I was left alone with my thoughts, trying to make sense of what was happening to me. One day, Mr. Johnson came to visit me. He looked different, almost like a different person. His eyes were no longer glowing, and his expression was calm and collected as when I originally met him. "I'm sorry for what I did," he said. "This was all a test to make sure you're the right person for the job." He unlocked the cell and led me out, offering me food and water. He seemed sincere, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease because of the experience I had just lived through. As he led me back to the main house, I noticed a strange symbol carved into the wall. It was a circle with a triangle inside, and it looked ancient. "What's that symbol?" I asked. Mr. Johnson looked at the wall and then back at me. "It's nothing," he said. "Just an old family emblem." But I wasn't convinced. I knew that symbol was important, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected to the strange things happening on the island. That night, I snuck out of my room and made my way to the basement. I found the symbol again, this time etched into the stone floor. It was surrounded by candles and strange artifacts, including a human skull. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around to find Mr. Johnson standing there, a wicked grin on his face. "You shouldn't have come down here," he said. "Now you know too much." He lunged at me, but I managed to dodge his attack. I ran up the stairs with Mr. Johnson hot on my heels. As I reached the top, I slammed the door shut, trapping him in the basement. I ran to the front door, but it was locked. I was trapped. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. I turned around to find Mr. Johnson standing there, covered in blood. His eyes were glowing again, and he was holding a bloody knife in his hand. "You can't leave," he growled. I backed away, trying to find something to defend myself with. But there was nothing. I was completely defenseless. Mr. Johnson lunged at me, and I closed my eyes, waiting for the end. But it never came. When I opened my eyes again, Mr. Johnson was lying on the ground, dead. Standing over him was a figure in a black hooded robe. I couldn't see the face, but I could feel the eyes on me. "You're free now," the figure said, "but you must leave this island immediately." I didn't hesitate. I ran out of the house and miraculously found the boat that had brought me to the island waiting for me. As we pulled away, I looked back at the estate. The figure in the black robe was still standing there, watching me. Days later, while doing research on the internet, I came across the legend of the Black Robes. It spoke of a group of supernatural beings that maintained the balance between good and evil by hunting down satanic worshippers. I was perplexed with my findings, and for weeks the thought of coming so close to my end and staring death in the face consumed me. I never spoke of my experience on that island again, but the memory of it still haunts me to this day, and whenever I see a strange Craigslist ad, I think twice before responding.